I'm excited to learn with y'all. Let me share my screen. Okay, so can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
The thumbs up would be helpful. Awesome, great. Okay. So when we think of kosher wine, what are like the first things that come to your mind?
Mine is non-mavushal.
Non-mavushal, okay.
Yep.
Is that your preference is non-mavushal?
What?
Is that your preference, non-mavushal?
Yes, and it's no longer even about the various connotations. It's actually the wine seems to be better.
Mm-hmm.
If they're going to bother to put something out at that price, they're going to be very careful what they're making.
What comes to my mind that it is totally different than what we think about kosher food. All the rules about kosher wine has nothing to do with kosher food.
Mm.
Almost all.
So say more about that.
Well, you know, the kosher food is to be about the shrita and about not mixing, and all the 3 rules in the Bible, mafris parsa and all this. But here it's totally different rules, and it seems to me that they are written much later.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I'm impressed. Normally when I ask that question, the first answer is, Manischewitz, or it's too sweet, or so I'm impressed that you all seem to be coming from a more sophisticated or more experienced place of knowing about kosher wine. So, kosher wine, as you said, Amalia, very nicely, right? It's a very different set of rules and a different purpose to the hechsher than the rules around food and kashrut to an extent. We can talk about that. But I think it's interesting because there are many Jews who will only drink wines with a hechsher. There are many who will explicitly not drink wines with a hechsher. And then there are a lot of Jews that have, and many people who have no idea what makes a wine kosher in the first place. And I get that question a lot where it's like, what about wine could possibly be not kosher, right? Well, there's clearly no pork in it, and there's no this, and there's no that. So how could it, what would make it kosher? What would make it not kosher? So what makes...
Can I interrupt a sec?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so a long time ago when I was a kid, I remember one of my grandparents took me to see Fantasia, and the lead-in was a clip that showed the people stomping on the grapes.
Right.
So she did a great job.
Nice. Yeah. So what makes wine different from other foods and beverages? By saying there's something in the chat. Oh, yes, absolutely. So one of the things that makes wine different from other food and beverages is that it's really, it has religious significance, right? That wine is something that is hekdesh, that is set aside for the purpose of sanctifying God. And there's really no other, I personally can't think of another equivalent of that. When we make challah, we do a kind of like a mock offering to God of the challah by burning it. There are things that are reflective, but they're not, it doesn't have the same sacral power that wine does. So when we use wine, it's for things like kiddush, right? Which is literally from the word hekdesh, to set aside to sanctify God, to sanctify the day of Shabbat. Havdalah, to separate between Shabbat and Chol and what's mundane and normal in the world. Any kind of holiday, pretty much Rosh Hashanah and Passover and the beginning of any Shavuot or any of those holidays, we offer a glass of wine, right, and we say kiddush over it, to transform it in a way from just a glass of wine to something that is sacred. And then, of course, it's life cycle events at weddings, a bris, a baby naming, pretty much everything with the exception of a funeral. We have wine as a way of sanctifying and of creating joy, right? So wine is a symbol of joy in Judaism. As Psalm 104 says, it gladdens the heart of people. And it's integral to part of celebrations and Jewish rituals. It's a key ingredient in the celebration of Shabbat, weddings, and holidays. And because of its ritual importance, the rabbis of the Talmud are very serious about the laws surrounding it. And additionally, halakha, Jewish law, requires that Jews sanctify Shabbat through the act of saying kiddush over wine. So because you have to say kiddush, you have to sanctify the wine as a means of sanctifying Shabbat itself. Also, I'm going to say, if you have any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, pop in as we go. Especially because we've got a nice small group, I think it would be great to have a conversation. And Emily, please feel free to participate as well.
So I had a question.
Yeah.
So your first two topics were exactly about the other, the girl, the intermediate.
Oh my,
How is this the other?
I'm sorry, I missed your question because you froze for a second.
But your first topics were about the other. That's the name of the topic. Right? So the girl in the intermarriage. What about the wine in the other?
That's a great question. We're getting there. Yeah, that's exactly the point, and we're definitely going to cover how wine plays into this conversation about how we relate to people who are different from us. Great. So the rabbis pull out like 3 different types of kosher of wine, and they go into great detail about what makes wine kosher. But when you read the laws of kashrut in the Torah, it says nothing about wine, right? It's all about food. But the rabbis take this excerpt from Deuteronomy, from the very, very end of Deuteronomy, right? This is Ha'azinu, the second to last Torah portion. And from this pasuk, from this verse, they pull out the laws of kashrut. Unclear if they are, which way things happened, right? Most likely it seems that they read back into the text, a prohibition that they were keen on having for the purposes of maintaining some boundaries. So it says Deuteronomy 32, 36, and 39. For Adonai will vindicate God's people and take revenge for God's servants. When Adonai sees that their might is gone and neither bond nor free is left, Adonai will say, where are their gods, the rock in whom they sought refuge, who ate the fat of their offerings and drank their libation wine? Let them rise up to your help and let them be a shield unto you. See then that I am God. There is no God beside me. I deal death and give life. I wounded and I heal. None can deliver from my hand. So this is from Ha'azinu, which is it's this beautiful song, but it's generally a bummer. It's Moses' last song that he offers, his parting words to the Israelites. And it is pretty angry, and it's reflecting future faithlessness and misdeeds by the Israelites. And so here there's we've got, one of our first examples of sarcasm, right? When Adonai says, like, where are their gods, the rock whom they sought refuge, who ate the fat of their offerings and drank their libation wine, right? So saying, the Israelites are going to be unfaithful to God. They're going to worship these other gods, but like, what are those other gods going to do for them? Nothing, right? Because I'm Adonai and I'm the one who's going to take care of them. And that one line in yellow, who ate the fat of their offerings and drank their libation wine, is the line that the rabbis point to say, this is why we cannot consume wine that has been produced or touched by someone who is not Jewish, right? This is the line that they draw from. And there's a couple of different ways that they play around with this that we'll look at. But I just think it's, you know, the text seems to be referring to the gods of the enemies of Israel, not to Israel itself. And the text never explicitly states that Israelites are forbidden from profiting from idolatrous wine. So as opposed to the laws of kashrut, where it's very, well, sometimes it's very clear. You know, it says like, you shall not eat this, you shall not cook this, right? It's very clear. And here, I don't know that it was the original intent of this verse was to be a prohibition against idolatrous wine. Specifically, it's more about a warning against idolatry overall. So in Avodah Zarah, right? So Avodah Zarah literally is the tractate that is dedicated to idolatry, right? And the things that that Jews should not be doing in order to not participate in idolatrous practices. So they lay out 3 types of prohibited wine here. Rabbi Asi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who said it on behalf of Rabbi Judah ben Betera, there are 3 kinds of wine. Wine poured for idolatrous purposes, yain neshech, from which it is forbidden to derive any benefit, and of which a quantity the size of an olive causes grave defilement. Ordinary wine of non-Jews, which is called stam yainam, from which it is likewise forbidden to derive any benefit whatsoever, and a quarter of which renders drinks for edibles unclean. And lastly, wine of an Israelite, yayinu, that has been deposited with an idolater, which must not be drunk, but the benefit of it is permitted. So we have these three categories, right? So the first is yain neshech, which is wine that has been specifically poured for the purposes of idolatrous worship. Stam yainam, which is wine that has been poured for idolatrous purposes, but was not seen firsthand, right? So the assumption being an idol worshiper who has a bottle of wine, you can't drink from that because you don't know where that bottle of wine has been, right? You don't know if they had made an offering before they poured you a glass. And then the third is wine that was created by a Jewish person, by an Israelite, but that was either sold to an idolater or that an idolater is pouring for them. And that also must not be drunk by a Jew, but the benefit of it, so meaning like you could sell kosher wine, it's fine to sell kosher wine to someone who's not Jewish. So what do you notice about these 3 categories and the permissibility that the rabbis create around them? Anything stand out to you?
We cannot drink any of them.
You can't drink any of these 3, but if it's wine that was created by Jews and only touched by Jews, right? What's missing here is what is permitted, which is simply that if it's wine that was created by a Jew and served by a Jew, then it's good. And then we'll also get into ways that you can drink wine that was created by a Jew but poured by a non-Jew in a moment.
We had a timely lesson on that, but my understanding of the wine of an Israelite that has been deposited is because it had been in a cask, not bottled, or even if it's been sealed.
I think this is either way.
Wow.
Yeah, I think this is either way, right? Because if at some point they do talk about if it has been sealed and given to an idolater and then given back, as long as it is still sealed, it is fine. Because it's clear that they didn't pour it out because there's still a seal on it. Is that what you're referring to?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, but I think as you know, you see the wine poured for idolatrous purposes, right? Like it's completely forbidden. Even the size, even the quantity of an olive, which would be not a very good. That's like not even a sip of wine, right? So you can't get absolutely nothing from something that is clearly for idolatrous purposes. Something that's questionable, you know, you can't have any more than a quarter. So 0.125 liters, which is small, but bigger than what is permitted for idolatrous purposes. And then the wine of an Israelite that's been deposited with an idolater can't be drunk, but it is, you are allowed to sell it. So as the type of wine becomes less overtly associated with idolatry, the greater the quantity that Jewish person is allowed to derive benefit from. Right, so derived benefit is this like great term because it includes both financial benefit as well as consumption, right? That there are multiple ways that we can benefit from, you know, from wine or from other products. Any questions so far? Okay. So, yain nesech, right? Wine poured for idolatrous purposes, from which it is forbidden to derive any benefit, and of which the quantity the size of an olive causes grave defilement. Yeah, Martha.
I'm her husband. Didn't
Oh,
Rambam
hi.
say that Christians and Muslims were not idolaters within the meaning of that law?
I'm sorry. So we're gonna get there. Right now, the rabbis are talking specifically about idolaters, and then the question becomes later on, you know,
Okay.
okay, but Christians that, you know, the rabbis conclude that Christians are not idolaters, that Muslims are not idolaters, but the laws still exist, and we'll get that after we go through our rabbinic sources, then we'll look at contemporary responses and contemporary reimaginings of this moment. Great. So why the strict rules about only Jews? So in the past, wine was often used by pagans in their offerings to idol gods. So when something good happened, you'd pour out some wine on the ground as a symbolic thank you, right? That's how idol worshipers would basically say a blessing, right? Would be just like to pour some out, which is funny because today you hear, you know, like, oh, pour one out for my homies, or, you know, pour one out, right, is a common phrase. And I think it actually stems from that. So the rabbis who set up the rules for kosher wine want to make sure that Jews never got a glass of wine that had been associated with an idolatrous offering. So they required that Jews only be involved in handling kosher wine. So going back to, you know, what I talked about in the very beginning about wine being important for Jews because it created sanctity, it also, I think one of the things that made wine such an important question for the rabbis was that wine was also an important, you know, beverage and object for creating sanctity for idol worshipers. And so because it was the same, it looks the same, and it you know, debatably tastes the same, right? That there is that worry that, you know, it feels familiar, it looks familiar, it could be mistaken. And so the rabbis are finding ways to create a fence around the Torah, right, to create ways of ensuring that people don't make mistakes. So the next is Stam Yainam, which is wine made by a non-Jew for everyday use. So there are two concerns with a wine that was made by a non-Jewish person. Also, the rabbis later are, you know, halacha later on becomes specific to say a Jew who keeps Shabbat, right? Who keeps the laws of kashrut, right? So the rabbis just used Jew because to them, every Jew kept Shabbat, right? There wasn't, you know, it was before a time when there were Jews who didn't keep Shabbat. But today, right, like I'm a Reform rabbi, I don't keep a halachic Shabbat. I would not be permitted to work at a kosher winery today in Israel, for example. But so there's two concerns. One is like accidental idolatry, right? There's a concern that if wine that was made by a non-Jew was poured by a non-Jew for a Jew, that person might be, thinking about Baal or, thinking about one of their gods while they're pouring the wine. And then all of a sudden that wine becomes idolatrous wine, which is really fascinating to think that in a certain way, like the rabbis had an understanding that there was some kind of power, right? That there was some sanctity that was being created, even if it wasn't permissible sanctity, right? But acknowledging the efficacy of the action itself. So that was one concern. And the other is actually like the mixed dancing argument, right? That Sue Fishkoff in her book, Kosher Nation, which I highly recommend. It's a great book that's a bunch of different essays about different aspects of kashrut in contemporary American life. But she says, wine drinking was a social activity that would bring Jews into contact with non-Jews in an atmosphere where inhibitions became lowered. That could lead to sexual intercourse, which could lead to intermarriage. So this idea that, somehow by drinking together, that drinking together is a way of fraternizing together, which would lead to more mixing and to intermarriage. So Martha and Minda asked about beer. Yeah, so beer, there are some laws around beer, but it's much easier because you don't have, like the grapes are really the issue and kiddush is really the issue. Like an idolater wouldn't pour out beer, it would only be wine. And you can't say kiddush over anything except for wine. So wine is the big issue. So if you, like in terms of alcohols, the most challenging, the type of alcohol that has the most restrictions on it would be wine. But there are other issues like with whiskey, with barrels, and sometimes the barrels have pork fat in them, and so there are different. You will still find a hechsher on certain alcohols, but wine is the main one.
You've made me think about beer because I hadn't realized until recently you can have beer that is alcoholically well over what the wine is, which then seems to feed into the mixed whatever and slippery slope consequences. I never thought of it before. So, but I've never seen restrictions on beer other than when to buy it after Pesach.
Right. This is what is that called? An explanation for the law that exists after the law was created, I would say, right?
Got it.
I think first and foremost, it's about idolatry. And then over the years, when like idolatry wasn't as much of an issue, the question was, well, then why are we still observing these laws if I'm not worried about, if I don't think my Christian neighbor or my Muslim neighbor is an idolater, then why do I care? What difference does it make? And this was one of the examples. But it's a great point that, beer and like any type of hard alcohol is going to have a higher ABV than wine. And so actually sharing a glass of vodka with your neighbor would be more likely to lead to a higher level of intoxication and inhibitions being lowered than a glass of wine. Interesting point. All right. Speaking of people sitting down and having a glass of wine together and fraternizing, so this is actually like one of my favorite texts from the Talmud. So it's a piece of Agada, right? So a non-halachic piece of text that we find in the Talmud. So which is normally narrative, but basically the two categories are halakha, which is law, and then anything that's not halakha, which is agada. So Shmuel and Ablet, so Shmuel is the Jew, Ablet is the Gentile scholar, were sitting together, and others brought cooked wine before them. And we'll get into cooked wine next. Ablet withdrew his hand to avoid rendering the wine prohibited to Shmuel. Seeing this, Shmuel said to Ablet that the sages said, cooked wine is not subject to the prohibition of wine used for a libation. and therefore you need not withdraw your hand on my account. So just off the cuff, what seems interesting or striking about this vignette, about this little story?
Well, I'm
Anything to
definitely, oh,
Sure.
sorry.
I defer to you.
Thank you. I mean, I'm definitely wondering why the cooked wine is different than the non-cooked wine. It's not intuitively clear to me why that would be non-prohibited here.
Awesome. Yeah, we will definitely get to that. Amalia?
The non-Jews that protected you from drinking it.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The non-Jew is the one who protects the Jew from drinking it.
Yeah, right. So this non-Jewish scholar seems to cares about making sure that his friend doesn't sin, essentially, right? Doesn't do this violation, and seems to know the laws of kashrut, right? Seems to know that, you know, that this is something that he should be looking out for. Anything else, Amalia?
No.
Yeah. And Martha and Minda, did you want to add something?
I like that the implication here is these guys are on the equal level. They're scholars sitting together. And I forget where it comes from, but I know there's something about when scholars sit together, there is already the implication. I forget whether that means they are studying the Torah anyway.
You're saying because they were sitting together?
Yeah. I'm saying there's, I forget the expression, but somewhere in, I think, Talmud or Pirkei or whatever, when scholars sit together, the implication already is that what they will be studying.
Yes. So normally, right, that's a good point. So that normally if it says, you know, like Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi so-and-so were sitting together, the assumption is that they're sitting together and studying Torah. So, you know, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, that Shmuel would be sitting with a Gentile scholar and studying whether or not they're studying Torah or if they're just studying something else, right? But maybe they are studying Torah because it seems like Elliott knows what's up in terms of wine and kashrut, right? So, you know, I enjoy this piece because it offers us a look into what might have been the real life applications of the halachot surrounding wine that we've been looking at. And it's interesting to note that this text shows us an instance, whether it's fictional or real is a different question, of a rabbi spending time with and consuming wine with a non-Jewish scholar, as you guys said. And that the non-Jewish scholar seems to be familiar with the laws of kashrut and demonstrates a concern that his friend observe them and not violate them. And then lastly, getting to Emily's point, right, it functions primarily to demonstrate the act of mibushal, the idea of cooking the wine, that renders wine touched by a non-Jew as kosher. So there is, of course, the question of whether or not this is an accurate, right? Like whenever you have a piece of Agada in the Talmud, we don't really know if this actually happened or not, but it must have been a convincing enough story that it made it in, right? That when it was redacted, that they said like, oh yeah, this feels realistic in whatever way it feels realistic. But now we're going to talk a little bit about what that cooked wine is and how that makes a difference. So mevushal is essentially like the solution for stam yanam, and also kosher wine being poured by waiters and waitresses or someone who's not Jewish, is that the rabbi said what you can do is you can take the wine and you can cook it at a very high temperature, because an idolater won't produce an offering that has been boiled. Really, because when you cook wine, you lose some of the flavor, and so it isn't as fragrant and as potent as it was before. So basically, that's where you get the word. You'll hear mevushal and non-mevushal. So mevushal literally just means cooked. And so if you look at a bottle of kosher wine, if you look at the back, you can see a label that either says mevushal or non-mevushal, right? That it wasn't cooked, which means that only someone who is an observant Jew, right? A Jew who observes halakha and Shabbat has touched that wine, from picking the grapes to smashing the grapes to cooking the wine to bottling and sending out. Yeah, Martha and Minda.
Okay, so one of the things I've been told, we have several wine shops in our area that all of which have major kosher wine sections. And what I have been told by all of them is if the bottle does not specify, that is for you to know that it is not mavushal, which seems kind of odd to me. I've never gotten a good explanation of why. Oh yeah, just assume. That's all.
Yeah. Well, I think because if it has a hechsher on it and it doesn't say mevushal, right? If it wasn't cooked, then the assumption is that the only reason why it has that hechsher, the only reason why the authoritative body who came in and checked out the winery and made sure everything was okay and put the stamp on it, the only way they would do that is if it was either mevushal, in which case it would be marked as such, or the assumption is that it was only touched by an observant Jew. Yeah, because non-mevushal also is like not like it's not a real term, right? Because you have mevushal, which is Hebrew, and non, which is, is English. So it's not like a real category. Of anything, it's kosher wine and mevushal wine, right? Because that non-mevushal is in a certain way the standard, right? That's the norm. And then mevushal is a way of kind of getting around the law. But you might have also heard that mevushal and yeah. Was that Amalia?
It's so Jewish. They argue about the degrees of it to be mevushal between 165 or 190.
Oh, in terms of the degrees?
Right. I mean, there's something to argue about. I don't know if it's...
Oh, yes. Well,
Very Jewish.
Yeah, yeah. But you might have noticed that, I don't know if you've ever heard, that like mevushal wine tends to taste not as good as non-mevushal wine, right? So, and that's because when you are cooking it, you are actually, right? I mean, the reason why the idolaters aren't going to use it for their offerings is because if you cook it, then it's not as delicious. So it's like an interesting circle that the rabbis make there. But in recent times, the rabbis, contemporary rabbis have come up with ways of doing mevushal in a way that doesn't make the wine taste quite as bad. So there's this process called flash pasteurization, where you basically just like make it really, really hot for a short period of time. And it somehow does the same thing and makes it mevushal, but it tastes better than if you actually cooked it. But it's an interesting thing because if you think about the original reasoning behind having to cook it, it was that idolaters wouldn't use it because it didn't taste as good. So if you do flash pasteurization and it still tastes good, it's questionable. But these are the kinds of things that the rabbis talk about and try to figure out, right? So Moshe Feinstein says that it just needs to be 165 to 175 degrees. It's a little bit lower for white wine, that's for red wine. And then Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Greenwald says it needs to be 190 degrees. So some contemporary responses. So first this is from a responsa from Rabbi Elliott Dorf of the conservative movement in 1985, going back to that question of, I think that Martha had of like, but haven't we decided that Christians and Muslims are not idolaters? So why do these still exist today, right? And so Rabbi Elliott Dorf says, we can presume that Gentiles who produce and serve wine in the Western world are not idolaters in the halachic sense of the term, right? So for the conservative movement, there is still kosher and non-kosher wine, but it's conceived a bit differently. And in that same 1985 responsa, they say that the main goal of the prohibition is about intermarriage. They go back to that original reasoning that the reason why we keep these separate is to prevent intermarriage, but he then goes on to argue, but it doesn't really seem to make a difference. So we should just let kosher wine fall into disuse. And then of course in the Reform movement, the topic of kashrut is thrown out entirely by the earlier reformers. So the topic of kosher wine doesn't necessarily come up as an issue in that way. This is also an interesting one. So these are two, there's a synagogue in Washington, D.C. It's called Tikkun Leil Shabbat, Minyan. And it's like a very young, hip minyan. And it seems that from the article that I read about it, it kind of draws from a wide array of young Jewish adults of varying levels of observance. And they had this huge argument over whether or not they should be providing kosher or non-kosher wine at Oneg. It's like so quaint now to think about a time when we served wine at an Oneg. It's gonna be a long time until we do that again, but it ended up being like a very heated conversation. And so here were just two takes on it, right? Two opposing sides. So one person said, if you walked in the door and saw a sign that said no Black people were involved in making this food, would you eat it? So making the argument essentially that, that it's inherently racist or xenophobic to only offer that kosher wine is inherently xenophobic or racist by saying anyone who's not Jewish who has touched this wine has somehow rendered it impure or unsuitable for ritual consumption. And then on the other side of the argument, someone said, I find it meaningful to sanctify Shabbat over wine made by folks who also sanctify Shabbat. It's not about xenophobia or racism. It's about wanting to use food prepared by others who share this Shabbat thing with me. Yeah, Martha.
One moment. I'm going to ask friends who are of that persuasion, that is halachic African-American Jews, do they know of a winery where we can get such and make everybody happy?
You mean finding a winery that, like a kosher winery that... Where
the mashgiach is not perceived as Caucasian, is an African-American halachic Jew or whatever.
So I think the point that they were making here is less about, I think that this person, we'll get to that in a second because it gets a little bit deeper in Israel, right? But I think the point that they're making is that it's that just having someone different from us who doesn't identify as Jewish, and I think they're using the example of Black people as a way of like making it even more potent of an example. But I think this person, if there was someone who was a Jew of color who was an observant Jew and was keeping Shabbat, and then they would still be considered. It would still be considered kosher wine, right? I think the issue is more about is making a point about making a judgment about someone's race and how them touching the wine would affect the kashrut status. But race definitely plays into this, and it'll play in the next example that I bring. I'm curious to hear where people, where any of the three of you would fall in, like which side you think you would agree with.
The first example is very interesting to me because I think there's a power differential that I feel like isn't taken quite into account. Like in the example they use, it assumes, I think, like a white majority Jewish space. making these distinctions based on race, but actually when we think about what it means to not drink wine prepared by non-Jews, that's like a minority making that judgment towards like a majority. So like the power dynamics are quite different to me. So I don't think it's actually a quite the right equivalency. And I think it kind of, it a little bit like reinterprets or reimagines this idea of what it means to kind of have that sanctity and like doing things because other Jews have created it. So as somebody who's like not at all kosher, doesn't really follow these things, when I see these two different points of views, like the second one actually resonates with me more, because I think that there's a power dynamic that's not quite being held here.
Interesting.
But one of the values of the Reform movement especially, but others too, is inclusion, and respecting the other. So that's come basically to much more a philosophical question, is just respect him because he is the other. I see it as a very nice value.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, but what we've been talking about, you know, throughout this course, right? You know, obviously not everyone has participated in all three, but I think, you know, one of the questions that my chavruta and I really wanted to tackle is, you know, when do we draw that boundary, right? You always have to draw a boundary at some point, right? In order to be a people, in order to have a culture, in order to be a religion, there is an in-group and an out-group. You know, boundaries are important, but when do boundaries become, you know, either violate our values or become oppressive or, you know, somehow nefarious or negative in nature? And so, you know, one of the things we're really setting out to look at is how has our tradition over the years navigated that tension between inclusion and exclusion, and trying to figure out where that boundary is and where it can be porous and where it needs to be more solid. Yeah, Martha and Minda.
Okay, you can call me Martha.
Oh, Martha.
I'm coming from the other side of the spectrum of modern orthodoxy. If I came somewhere and I saw that sign, I would turn around on my heels. That's number one.
I'm sorry, you saw which sign?
If I saw a sign saying no Black people were involved in making this food, it's not a question whether I would eat it. I would leave if I saw such a sign. It's totally disgusting. I just want to bring one thing I find from our congregation. I've heard this from others. It is my understanding that in general, and in Israel, I do have a what they call intermarried Ashkenazi Sephardi family. People will not necessarily eat in the homes of Sephardim. Do not generally eat in the homes of people who are, I forget whether it's not Sephardi or just they're not their family, so they don't know their level of kashrut.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point that also that, and we'll see that again in the next example that we get to in a moment, right? But that there's also othering within the Jewish faith, and that is right. There are sometimes boundaries that we put up within the Jewish faith because we want to, you know, maintain sanctity of a certain thing, or, you know, a reflection of values or whatever it might be. You know, for example, I keep a kosher kitchen in a pretty liberal way, right? We have separate dishes, and we don't cook, you know, non-kosher meat, but I will buy a product that doesn't have a hechsher on it, as long as it doesn't have any ingredients that are not inherently treif. But I have a very good friend who's a modern Orthodox rabbi, and he wouldn't feel comfortable eating in my home. So, you know, I think it's also about, you know, making those personal decisions about what we're comfortable with and what we're not. Unfortunately, sometimes those are informed by, you know, racial stereotypes or xenophobia, or, you know, othering of people in a negative way. And it's a tightrope walk. But we'll get to Oh, well, first of all, so the solution that they came to, in case you were wondering, is that they had empty cups. They would put out empty cups, and they would put out both kosher and non-kosher wine, so everyone could pour what they thought was appropriate for them. Interesting solution. But this next example is our last example. Is an example of how that the boundary of kosher wine has manifested itself in contemporary Israel in a way that is pretty, overtly racist. So this is an excerpt from an article in Haaretz called "Not Jewish Enough: Israeli Winery Drops Ethiopian Workers from Production Line." So
I remember.
So this is an article from June 2018 that highlights how issues around kosher wine have serious repercussions today. In 2018, the Barkhan Winery faced sharp criticism after the company, in order to quell concerns that they were not Jewish, reassigned several Ethiopian Jewish workers to jobs that didn't directly interact with the grapes or the wine. And the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel responded to the move with harsh criticism. Kosher wine still remains a flashpoint for issues surrounding Jewish authenticity and legitimacy, and also raises questions of who holds the authority to designate who counts as Jewish and who does not. And here, obviously, I think it's pretty clear that racism played a significant part in an interpretation of who counts as Jewish and who doesn't count as Jewish. Yeah, Martha.
It's also playing to their market. Barkhan is not a high-end market, and if their hechsher is coming from the Badats, who I don't even want to talk about a lot of the things they do, that's their market. It's a target segmented market. So I wouldn't use this as a strongest example. It's an ugly one, but it's not a strong one.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I also think we have, if you walk into any kosher, any place that sells kosher wine, like you will see Barkhan on the shelves, right? And so I personally feel like having this, like knowing that Badatz is the one that's offering the hechsher, and that they have these kinds of practices, and that they've had issues in the past, helps me to make a decision about the types of kosher wine and the companies of kosher wine that I will purchase or not purchase.
And of course, in Israel, it was also an issue of the tension between the Haredim and the secular Jews. It was also It was also a political issue in Israel.
Yeah.
But there is a tension between Haredim and between the secular Jews, which is so strong and divisive that it was just basically more than.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot at play here. But I think anytime we're talking about an issue where we can create a boundary, often becomes a political issue, because the act of othering or of saying you are not or you are not permitted is a way of consolidating power and of maintaining power. So Amalia, have we answered your question of what about kosher wine has anything to do with the other?
Definitely did, and I emailed you my email address so you can send me previous lectures.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the issue of kosher wine really highlights that tension between embracing the other, right? We have a literal example of sitting down and sharing a drink just as Shmuel and Ablet did, as well as maintaining boundaries and values. And it's the question that as Jews, and in this moment as American Jews, we're constantly struggling with and renegotiating. How do we embrace the other while also maintaining our uniqueness and integrity? And like that, just kind of negotiating that boundary all the time. Any final thoughts or questions before we wrap up?
Very interesting.
Thank you so much for coming, Martha and Amalia and Emily. It was a great a great session. Tangent. Oh, Tanuva has amazing cheese, mostly non-halal Yisrael, therefore not marketed here. I think I've seen Tanuva here before.
There is. It's a totally different one.
Oh,
I've
really?
gotten a friend of mine is an organization called Achi Kli, the idea of buying things from Israel. And I saw the pamphlet and I said, what's Tanuva USA? And they said, oh, we're what Tanuva will send to the American market. I mean, they didn't put it that way, but it was between the lines.
Yeah.
So you might find that interesting, but this was terrific.
Great. Well, thank you for joining. Thank you for participating. Let me make sure I get your, let me stop my share. Let me make sure I get your email addresses down. I see them in there. I just want to make sure I copy them before the chat disappears.
And I need to say that I've never been to any of the Zoom lectures that were such a small group, which actually have a feeling of chavruta. It was just great.
Yes.
Sometimes it's welcome.
Ask her now.
Oh, where did you say that you are at this point? What state?
I'm in Louisiana.
That's what I thought. Okay, that's one of our goals when this is over.
Is to come to New Orleans?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. You have to let
my
us know when
husband
you're
has
down here.
been here, and I've never been. My daughter has been there. I've never been, and I'm really, and ever since I read on all other nights, I've been very curious.
Yes, you would. And when you're done, make sure